Hello, investigators, and welcome to Until the End of Time. My name is Veronica, and today we are talking about the most recent FAQ updates and the taboo list therein. So it's kind of funny, I was looking at doing one more video before my school year started, and then we got a new FAQ, so great timing. There are a bunch of rules updates in this one as well. I'm not going to go over all of them unless they're relevant for the specific taboo. But if you are interested in any of this, just go and read it yourself. There's a lot of good clarifications in the article as well. So if you're interested about any of this, just go check that out. And if you still have questions, feel free to go into the rules discussion on the Mythosbusters Discord, discord.gg/Mythosbusters, and ask there because people will be happy to tell you. This video is going to be about the taboo list. And here is every change just in a list. Feel free to pause if you just want to check them out. I'm just gonna be honest at the start of this video. I try to make my channel be as positive as possible because I like this game. I want to be an advocate for this game. I want to be an advocate for the people who make this game, and I think they put a lot of effort in, especially when they are producing this kind of free content that, you know, is just making the game stay alive and having the community, handing the community these tools to help moderate their decks and help discussion. That being said, there are some choices in this update. There are a lot of things in here that I don't agree with. I think that are bad either from a mechanical side of things, like a balance thing, or because I think it hurts what the taboo list is supposed to be about. It adds too much complexity. It changes things in ways that I don't agree with. And I'm going to try to do my best to stay generally positive, but I also want to be honest and say it when I disagree with a certain choice. So with that out of the way, let's get started. And let's get started with the chain, unchain versions because those are probably the simplest. So there's a bunch of Dunwich cards that got cheaper. Switchblade has just been taken off the list. This was a +1 XP before, and I think that's perfectly fine. The Switchblade has always been on the list as kind of an outlier. People were worried, or well, people at FFG, at least one person at FFG, was worried that Switchblade would be too good in Tony decks, that it would be everywhere and it would force out all the other weapons. I don't think that's necessarily true, and I think that Switchblade being on the list is kind of unnecessary, and it also hampered certain other rogue decks at being good at combat. I think that it's kind of funny that it got off now because there's actually no new weapons for rogues in the in the Scarlet's keys, but I don't know, it's just, yeah, it's time for this thing to go off. It honestly probably could have gone off last list. It's fine. Next up is Pathfinder. Pathfinder has gone down to +1 XP instead of +2 XP. I'm torn on this one. I don't like Pathfinder being too cheap because it is very easy for it to feel like a must include. I was recently playing a Monterey Jack deck and I did everything I could to justify not playing Pathfinder. And a big reason, or a big part of why I was able to do that is because it was 3 XP. And to be clear, it's not like I have a problem with people playing Pathfinder, but I think that it is such a cheap, powerful effect that, cheap resource-wise, right? It's only 3 resources, and it basically gives you an extra action every turn, that it's hard to put in other cards over it. And it being at only 2 XP, I feel like is going to be... yeah, it's going to be very hard to argue against putting it in, because at least at 3 XP there were a bunch of other cool 3 XP effects you could include instead that might be equally as potent, or at least allow you to do other cool things. This is just making it so that most decks, I think, that can run Pathfinder are going to run Pathfinder again. I feel like it was healthier at 2 XP, and I'm not quite sure what encouraged them to lower it. I know that they said in the article that they feel that it would be less of a thing now because the carpals developed, and I'm not sure I agree with that. And speaking of not agreeing with it, Higher Education, Streetwise, and Scrapper have all gone off the list. These are the permanent cards from Dunwich that give you stealth boosting, and they are kind of bogeyman, right? They've been on the list since the start. They are incredibly powerful. Higher Education and Streetwise in particular were 8 XP at one point. They've gone down to 6 XP most recently. Scrapper only had a +1, so it was only 4 XP. But these cards are incredibly potent, and because they have the permanent keyword, you never have to worry about drawing them, you never have to worry about not having access to them. You will always be able to use these cards. And I don't think that this was a good idea. I think these cards should have stayed on the list. At the very least, Higher Education and Streetwise. I can argue that Scrapper should also be more XP than 3, because I think that the ability to have access to a resource dump in Survivor decks can be very potent if you're trying to play Dark Horse. It is also very nice to have an agility booster so that you can get out of trouble. And there are some Survivor decks that like to have the combat boost. But fine, if you wanna, remove cards from the list, make cards more accessible, getting Scrapper off the list, I don't think is that big of a deal. I do think that Higher Education and Streetwise should stay on the list. These cards are just overpowered. These cards are just straight up overpowered as they are printed, right? And the problem is that they are both overpowered and cheap enough that they should realistically be in every deck, right? There is a kind of mechanical balance thing where you are trying to figure out what you should spend your 3 XP on, and the correct option in this case is, if you have 3 XP coming out of scenario 1, is probably to buy one of these if you have access to them, because they are so powerful. And I don't love that. I think these are cards that just, I don't understand why they got taken off the list. I think Preston is a good reason to evaluate Streetwise again, because I think Preston decks really change with the accessibility of Streetwise. Whether or not you are going to be able to pump all your money into Streetwise, pass that way, or if you need to do something else. But also, I've seen Preston decks, maybe not happily, but definitely have played Streetwise when it was 6 XP. And so I feel like, why are you making this card that was widely acknowledged to be too powerful go back to its original state? I don't get it. I'm honestly a little bit baffled, and I would love to hear more from the developers about why they decided this was okay, because I just don't see it. If you want to make these cards more accessible because you feel like the rest of the meta basically has adapted and evolved to a different point, make them plus 2 XP, right? Knock 1 point of XP off of all 3 of these, so Scrapper goes down to 0, you can remove that one from the list. Higher Education, Streetwise are 5 now. I feel like even at that point, these cards are pretty powerful. So, yeah, I don't want to stay here because we have a lot more cards to get to, but these are not choices that I agree with. A couple other changes. Alright, Sharpshooter, minus 1 XP. Sure, I think this isn't enough to make Sharpshooter appealing to a lot of players, especially the more competitive-minded. They want to play Dirty Fighting instead, which is an asset that came out in Scarlet Keys and is very powerful and does a lot of what Sharpshooter wants to be doing, but way better. Notably, that one gives you an extra action, as well as giving you a plus 2 bonus on any fight that is against a evaded enemy, or exhausted enemy, if I'm specific. Sharpshooter has always struggled with, it needs to be a firearm asset, so you're already pretty limited. You can't use fight events with this one, and you can't use melee weapons with this one. And you then it really only cares about this if you have a investigator with a very high agility and low fight, which are only a couple. So I'm not convinced this card is a lot more powerful now and gonna see a lot more play now, but it's a step in the right direction, and definitely appreciate at the very least that it's on people's radar as, hey, this is a card we're going to be tweaking with the taboo list. A lot of people have been calling that this one should be made exceptional and permanent, so it becomes 6 XP to purchase, but you get it as a permanent asset. I like that approach a lot more than what this has done, but I'm curious because I haven't tried this yet, and I should mention I haven't tried any. The list that came out last night, right? I haven't had a chance to play any of this yet, and so I'll get back to seeing how this card plays. Maybe I'll put it in a deck and see how it plays. Riddick X. They added a dot of XP to Inscription of the Hunt. The only reason I think this is noteworthy is that it is changing a little bit, because chaining and unchaining historically has just been, it doesn't change the level of the card, but it just changes the amount of XP you have to spend. But because of the way customizable cards are formatted, I believe Inscription of the Hunt is now a 2 checkbox upgrade, and therefore would change the level of the card, which is not great. I don't love how customizables make mutations even more complicated. Not mutations, chaining, but also, it is what it is. And I understand Runic X is a very potent card. A lot of people have been talking about this one. So a small tweak, we'll have to see if it's enough. And then Shadowlight, this has also been a very big card recently. It turns out that being able to get 2 extra clues for only 2 resources fast is really, really, really good. and it's not that hard to set this up, and being able to get clues from high shroud locations by cheating low shroud locations is incredibly powerful. So it's been given the +2 experience treatment. I think that's fair. I still think the deck is probably very powerful once it gets rolling, but at least this way it will be a little bit longer before, and you'll have to spend XP there. You can expend XP on your old keyring or other stuff that makes your level 0 or difficulty 0 deck work. Then there are 2 boys who have disappeared from the list, but we will be seeing them again very shortly because they have gotten a mutation instead. Let's get to that right now. Now, it appears that the hot new Taboo tag is just to put a sensible maximum on certain effects. A lot of these cards, I think, were tabooed because if they don't have any kind of maximum, they are really, really powerful. But if you put a maximum on them, they get a lot more reasonable. Starting with David Renfield, who I voiced my opinion on this card being 3 XP before. I think it was utterly unnecessary. I think Renfield is honestly kind of a secretly important card for the Mystic faction, specifically for the parts of the Mystic faction that struggle, because he has a +1 willpower on a 2-cost asset. A lot of the Mystics that have 4 willpower often get criticized for being less good than the 5 willpower Mystics, and Renfield is a way for some of those decks to crawl back into that race by just getting another +1 willpower effect in your deck. Additionally, the resource gain, while not, I think, it's part of the complete package. That's the thing, right? Renfield by itself, any of these effects, like getting the +1 willpower, getting a doom, getting a resource, having 2 health, none of these effects by themselves make it too powerful, but altogether it's a very potent package and a card that you really should consider. I know that I've played Renfield in Patrice a bunch because the extra resource return can be very important in Patrice to play the right number of cards every turn. And yeah, so what's the actual change? I should mention that. He now has a limit. You cannot get more than 3 resources when you exhaust him. This is totally fine. There is very few situations in the game where that is even a thing that happens. Usually when that happens, it's in scenarios where the Doom Clock is doing something very weird. And people, I think, as general, have been like, okay, so they basically just removed him from the list and agreed that the 3 XP was just completely wrong. And I think for investigators like Marie, that's very important because Marie really needs you to have a way to get a Doom on your card in a kind of controlled way. And Renfield is that. So I think this is a good change. I think the research, like, he could potentially just be off the list again because 3 resources a turn is still an insane amount of money. But fine, if you want to have a maximum on him, have a maximum on him. Here he is. Speaking of which, Jeremiah Kirby, the Arctic archaeologist, has received the maximum of twice per game for his enters play effect. I think that's a sensible change. I have a little bit of a concern about memory issues because I don't like the idea that I have to track over the course of a long scenario how many times I've played Jeremy, because even if I don't have effects like Calling a Favor or Hit and Run, I could potentially loop my deck and play the copies of Jeremy more than twice. But I think that is a fair trade-off for not having to do an overly complicated mutation or otherwise messing with his XP cost, because he was at 2 XP and he's now back to 0. And I like that. I think he's good enough to be a solid level 2, or sorry, level 0 ally, but if he can just use his ability over and over again, using cards like Calling in Favors, Hit and Run, those sorts of effects, then he becomes too powerful. And one of the things that people have pointed out is that making him level 2 doesn't actually make the combo applications any less powerful, because you're still just triggering them just as often as soon as you spend the 4 XP on him, but it makes him basically a lot worse for non-combo players, right? If you are not doing any of these shenanigans, suddenly he's not worth the 2 XP anymore. This is a nice swerve in the correct direction, in my opinion, which is, hey, your combo no longer works, but if you just want to have a solid ally at level 0, then you can, which I like. And I do enjoy that the way it is worded, you can also still play him with Underworld support and get a bounce out of him, get an extra play. That's kind of nice. Alright, next up, I'd probably have to explain here, but this one's kind of funny. So Geared Up got a mutation, and I'll just quote from the dev here. Some other cards weren't necessarily above the power curve, but unlocked new and sometimes bonkers plays, such as Geared Up. Playing a bunch of discounted item assets turn 1 with this card feels great, but it was never the intent to enable an investigator to say, play half their deck on their first turn. Yes, someone did it with backpacks, you know who you are. Yeah, I do. I do know who I am. Yeah, so this is Geared Up. After it was clarified that you can play the items with Geared Up one at a time, people quite quickly figured out that, hey, you can use Backpack, which is an item itself, to go find 3 more items, and then you can keep playing those. Schaffner's Catalog, which came out in Edge of the Earth as well, gives you 5 resources effectively to play these items, so you can churn through your deck and have some pretty bonkers starts. I find it kind of funny, but also, yeah, sure. So what's the change? Well, there's now just a sensible limit, 5 items total. I've already heard some people push back against this. They say that it basically makes the card not worth playing anymore, and they liked the ability to play a bunch of items. And I get that. I've played this deck with a lot of, and I've had a lot of fun with it. I do think that 5 is probably a reasonable amount of value, right? Keep in mind, you are spending basically 3 actions to get 5 play actions and discount yourself 5 resources. That is a huge amount of value you are getting. But I also agree that part of the problem with Geared Up is that it was already not that good, and it saw most play, in my opinion, not in Guardian decks, but in other decks that could splash for it. My personal experience with this card has come from a Daisy Walker deck using the parallel Daisy deck building rules, because you get some Guardian access on that one. Because, for example, Daisy Tote Bag is a item, and it gives you extra hand slots, so you could play even more tomes at the start of the game. I think this change is probably fine. If it was any less, if it was 4 items, I'd be out. That'd be basically banning the card. I think it could be 6. I think if you make it 6, the game doesn't break, and I do think Geared Up is such a narrow card that, you know, you're only going to play it in decks that can take advantage of it, at least for 5 items, because otherwise losing your entire first turn is too big of a hit. But I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think it's a good spot to try, and we'll see. Maybe this is too narrow. Maybe we do need to change it. I think the problem is that Geared Up is so inherently linked to the combo applications, because if you don't play at least 3 or 4 cards, then why are you putting this in your deck? And you can't take it out. That's the big one, right? You can't start with a Geared Up deck and then decide to change later in the game. No, once you're committed to Geared Up, you're committed to Geared Up. So, I don't know. I think this one is fine. Yeah, then there's Burn After Reading. They were worried about the ability to play 8 copies of Burn After Reading in standalone, remove 8 Doom without any kind of drawback. Sure, I mean, Exile cards are overpowered in standalone mode. That's not news. But also, I've not really seen the kind of groups that played 4 or 2 copies of Burn After Reading at all. So I feel like this is kind of a needless addition to the Taboo list, but it's not a bad one, right? This is not making the card markedly worse, not changing the card in any dramatic ways. This is fine. The change is max twice per game, by the way. Alright, then we have Research Notes. This one's kind of funny. So, Research Note has been mutated so that the action ability to discover clues is now limited to max 3 evidence spent per round. Which is... Sure, I mean, I don't think I've had a lot of games where I was actually spending more than 3 evidence per round, and that card already felt pretty powerful. But I also agree that this is an important card for Daryl Simmons, because you need evidence generation assets. And so I get not wanting to nerf the evidence side of this card too bad. I don't know. I think max 3 is a good place to start, and we'll have to see how it plays out. But the funny part of this is that it actually got a bigger nerf in the FAQ than actually got in the mutation. So I suspect a lot of you will already know this, some of you might not, but Knowledge is Power is a card that lets you use a tome or spell asset ability without paying any of its costs. Before this FAQ, that meant that you could activate the ability on Research Notes and then just get one clue per point you succeeded by, because spending the evidence was considered a cost and you could therefore ignore it. With the rule 2.24, I guess, ignoring all cost, it now changes it so that only the effect before the colon, i.e. the costs of the ability, are ignored. Additional costs, such as spending the evidence, is now no longer ignored. So if you're using cards like Earthly Serenity, you have to spend the charges. And if you're using the Old Book of Lore, level 3, you have to spend the... Is it evidence? No, it's secrets. You have to spend the secret in order to play the cards with that. This is a important change to Knowledge is Power because it just stops the card from being stupid. So yeah, I think research notes, I think it's a little too early to be super critical of research note. It's only been out for about half a year, a little longer, and I don't know. I've not heard the entire the entire like community get up in arms about research note. It's a powerful card. I think this is a measured response, and I think it's good to start with a medium level change and see if it's enough or if it needs more adjustments. Now, as we've seen with the last couple of Taboo lists, they also buffed a couple of cards with mutations, and mostly to give deck builders something new to play with. Hypnotic Gaze, Banish, Persuasion, and Interrogate all got changed. Hypnotic Gaze and Banish got the ability to trigger on any symbol token. Not just the Skull, Cultist, Tablet, Elder Thing, and I believe Autofill in the case of Hypnotic Gaze, but I'm not quite sure. Basically, this enables Blast Curse and also technically Frost tokens. I feel that this change is made right now specifically because they know Kohaku Narukami is coming in the Hemlock Vale, which is also going to bring a bunch more Blessing Curse cards. I've made a video about this on the channel, so go check that out if you're like, who is this guy and how do we know that there's Blessing Curse tokens coming? I explain all that in that video. This really feels like preparing for a new wave of Blessing Curse decks, which may want to run a couple of these effects. Banish, notably, pretty cool effect, lets you teleport an enemy to any location, and then if you reveal a symbol token, the enemy doesn't ready for a turn. And Hypnotic Gaze is very expensive, but potentially powerful because it lets you deal the enemies, you dodge an attack, and then you get to deal the damage of the enemy back if you reveal a symbol token. The thing that I don't like, or the only criticism that I have here, is that for some reason they decided to taboo the level 0 Hypnotic Gaze and not taboo the level 2 version. And I want to be very clear that there are multiple instances of this happening in this taboo list itself, but the reason I bring it up is because these cards are so functionally similar, like the effect of revealing the symbol is so close to one another, that I don't really see a reason to separate the two. And in fact, I see compelling arguments not to, because now if I'm playing a Blessed Curse deck with Hypnotic Gaze in it, I no longer want to upgrade my Hypnotic Gaze in order to get that discount or potentially get benefit of the horror, because it turns off my ability to synergize with the Blessing Curse that I put in my deck. And I don't really understand why this choice was made. We do know that FFG is at the very least aware of it, and it probably was intentional. I haven't actually seen the chat, but I saw that somebody commented, hey, Duke has already commented on this. This was not a oversight, right? They knew about Hypnotic Gaze 2 not being affected by this. And yeah, do they think that Hypnotic Gaze 2 is already so powerful that buffing it more would be a problem? Because I don't agree with that idea. I think Hypnotic Gaze is a very rarely played card. If you disagree with me, please post in the comment if it's an auto-include in all your decks. But yeah, I think that if you're going to alter the level 0 version here, you should probably also alter the level 2, or like mutate the level 2 version, because it now gets into this really awkward spot where, yeah, you don't want to upgrade your card anymore because it actively gets worse, and that's bad. I think that's bad. Similarly to how the Hemlock Vale is going to bring us a bunch of Blessing Curse cards, it's also bringing us a new Parlay Investigator. Alessandra Zorzi, the Countess, gets an extra action to Parlay, and so we have 2 Parlay cards getting mutated. The specific mutation here is that it no longer requires a humanoid enemy for Persuasion or Interrogate. I think that's a good change. I like Interrogate. I've always been kind of mad on Persuasion, but I think Interrogate's a good card. And the fact that it was so campaign specific, there are a couple of campaigns where Interrogate is almost always online, and there are a couple of campaigns where it is literally unplayable. If you ever played Edge of the Earth, with the exception of like, I think 1 encounter set, there are no humanoids in that entire campaign. So good luck getting this to ever trigger. This makes a lot more sense. I think it does lose a little bit in thematics because obviously, you know, you are now able to persuade some great old... Well, you can't do great old ones. It's just... I guess it worked on the elites, yeah. So you can evade a Great Old One or an Elder Thing or whatever weird Shoggoth, which is a bit weird. It made more sense when it was just humanoids. But mechanics-wise, I like being able to put cards in my deck and play with cards. And with Alessandra coming soon, I think a lot of people will be looking at parlay cards again. And this is also maybe a hint that Alessandra will indeed be able to take parlay cards from any faction, at least at level 0, because otherwise, why buff these cards if she can't take them? Both of these have difficulty 3 tests, which she's not necessarily the best at, but Fine Clothes are a card, and that's going to be fine. There are a couple more minor bits and bobs before I get to the big boogeyman at the end. Daredevil level 0 got changed. Here it makes me a hypocrite because I complained about Hypnotic Gaze level 0 being changed and level 2 not being changed, but the thing is that Daredevil level 0 and Daredevil level 2 have a functional difference where in level 0 Daredevil, the old version, you used to discard every card that you revealed that wasn't a weakness and then only shuffle the weaknesses back. With Daredevil level 2, you shuffled every card you revealed that wasn't the skill back. The problem here was that Daredevil level 0 was getting used to combo with decks that wanted to have their entire deck in a discard pile and having basically, so if you didn't have any rogue skills, you could just commit this, discard your entire deck, and if you only had a single weakness left in your deck, because of the rules on shuffling a single card back into your deck, you would also discard that card. This gets around that. So that is, I think, most important for Wendy, because if the only weakness left in your deck was Abandon Alone, you can now no longer do that combo because you would discard your entire deck and then Abandon Alone would trigger and you would wipe out your entire deck. So I think this is this is closing a loophole on a card that otherwise I don't think is too interesting. It just makes the card a little bit more fair. And honestly, it might actually make the card a little bit more powerful, because if you're playing this in the kind of normal approach, like you're Winifred basically, and you're just trying to commit more cards, this is a nice way to actually draw a weakness as an additional effect on top of what you normally would, right? It's the same thing where like Rook drawing you an extra weakness isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as you're set up to take advantage of it. It is drawing an extra card. Trish got mutated. She now can only evade an enemy when she discovers a clue if that enemy is non-elite. So importantly, you can still get 2 clues at a location with an elite enemy, but you can no longer automatically evade elite enemies. I think this is a perfectly reasonable change, and in fact, I would argue it is a change that should have been there from the start. Automatically evading elite enemies can make certain scenarios way too easy, and this is a nice way to make elite still mean something, right? We've seen in the past that effects that can automatically evade elites can absolutely ruin scenarios, and this is just a nice way of making that, making Trish fall in line with the other effects that we've expected to not work on elites. And it doesn't make her ability that much worse, which is very nice. It's a very neat bit of design. And then finally, Ancient Covenant, which is not one that I was expecting, but makes sense when, again, Hemlock Vale is probably going to come with a bunch of new Bless and Curse cards. The change here is very subtle. The only thing that they have changed is that instead of being whenever an investigator at your location resolves a Bless token, it has become whenever you resolve a Bless token. So it's a bit more of a selfish effect now, which I mean, thematically it's maybe a little weird, but from a mechanics point of view, I kind of like, because it doesn't hurt solo decks, which is very nice. I always feel like some of these mutations tend to hit the solo player very hard, while making 4-player decks kind of shrug. But here it's actually the inverse. 4-player or 3-player decks who were counting on using the bless effects from other players to cheese scenarios can now no longer do this. And this is legitimately a thing that happened. I was playing a Carson deck not too long ago where I had the Guardian Covenant, but I was playing with 2 survivors who both had Ancient Covenant, and so when I was drawing Bless tokens during, say, Treachery tests, they would trigger Ancient Covenant and just negate the test, basically. This makes those decks a little bit worse, but not in a major way, and I think that right now, looking at it, it feels like kind of a nothing change, because you're still going to play Ancient Covenant if you are a Guardian, or if you're a Survivor Bless deck. But I feel that maybe when we get to the Hemlock Vale and we see all the Blessing Curse cards that are in that expansion, I think it will be a bit more nuanced at that point. That's at least my hope. Alright, and if you were just here, if you want to avoid all the negativity, just skip ahead now, because this is just going to be me ranting for a bit. They changed the power word, and I am not happy with it for several reasons. I think this is a example of how not to do mutations. And I say that with a lot of respect for the people who make these cards, because I believe that they can do better. I think they've made a mistake, and I think that this is not how they should have done this, but I think they should be aware of that and they should change it. Okay, so what's the actual change? They've changed it so that in order to give the command, you have to test willpower 3. If you succeed, you can give the command. It is still a parlay test. The cower command that was on the front of the power board has been moved to the checkmark page and now costs 1 XP. And they have completely removed the mercy command in order to make space for the cower command. This is terrible for several reasons. So for starters, let's start with the added complexity. Customizable cards were already really high on the complexity budget. They were already some of the most complex cards in the game. And I think that Power Word is actually one of the worst offenders there, in the sense that it was a powerful, or it was a customizable card that had a lot of options and a lot of deck building considerations. This is adding much more memory issues, a lot more having to remember you have to take the willpower test, you have to do a bunch of changes that are not very intuitive with how the card originally worked. So not a big fan there. Secondly, completely removing the mercy command actually has major deck implications for several important investigators. Vincent and Carolyn can no longer take this card above their deck building, which I think in case of Vincent means he can't take it at all, and Carolyn can only take it up to level 1, because she can take Mystic 0 to 1. These were two people who could both take this card, check the Mercy checkbox, and then have 9 other boxes, because it was now a card that healed damage or horror. Removing this, which therefore means you can no longer take this on 2 investigators, I really don't like that. I really think that one of the key concepts of the taboo list was that they were making power changes, but they weren't necessarily restricting access to certain investigators, right? One of the things with the reason why chains and unchained work the way they do is that it doesn't change the level of the card. This is effectively doing that in a slightly different way, which is just cutting off access to 2 investigators. Not a fan. But finally, and perhaps most egregiously, the whole reason people were excited about this card is that it was a testless way to do stuff. There is a, I would say, vocal minority, because I don't think it's that big of a group, but I do think that they are, there's a reasonable number of them who don't, of players who don't like doing everything through willpower in Mystic. They like doing the weird stuff in Mystic. They like messing with the Chaos back. They like messing with encounter cards. They don't like just stacking willpower and playing a bunch of very powerful spells, because they've done that since the core set, right? Mystic has done that for most of the life of the game. And this was a card a lot of them were excited about, because it was a way to do Tesla stuff in Mystic, messing with encounter cards, and all kinds of cool stuff. And now you're just slapping a willpower 3 test on there. And so now it's back to being a willpower card. I don't like that. I am not generally in agreement with the group that says, hey, Mystic needs to do less stuff with willpower, because I think that willpower in Mystic is fine. But I'm 100% with them here. You took what made this card very cool and unique, and you got rid of it. And I'm not there for it. If it were up to me, I haven't had a lot of time to think about this, so I'm copying a answer from somebody else in the Discord. What I would do is make either the tongue twister or try spoken command, get the willpower test. So put Mercy back on the sheet, put Cower back on the card, and add a willpower test to one of those 2, not to the entire card. If you want to nerf this card, and to be fair, I do think this card was maybe a bit too powerful, because a lot of people have been talking about how it does just straight up basically win the scenario once you're fully set up. I think you have to do that. Or you have to do something else. But I don't know. I think they really missed. I think they were trying something a little bit different with this one. They were trying for a bigger change. And I'm here to say that I'm not a fan of the outcome. So please try again. That's something I want to be clear. Like, this is not trying to be like, oh, how could you ever do this? This is terrible. No, I recognize that you were trying to do something here. But I think the consequences of something like removing a command are too big to just, you know, make that change. I think you should. I think you should try again. Just start from scratch. And then I have one more card to talk about because it's not on the list. And why isn't it? Empirical Hypothesis, I think, has been kind of agreed upon that it is the most powerful card in the Scarlet Keys box, and it is far outside the power level that it should be. At least that's my opinion, and I've heard it back a lot. Like, this is basically a slotless slotless lucky cigarette case. It is a rabbit's foot. It is, you know, it is an extra draw effect per turn. It is way too easy to get evidence on and draw a whole bunch of cards. And there is no mention of it on the taboo list. And I am very surprised by that, right? This is me questioning, hey, why are some cards being affected and why are some cards not being affected? And why is Empirical Hypothesis not on the list? And because I like to, you know, not just say, you know, criticize people and then not give any kind of input, I do have an opinion. I think that one taboo list they could try is just to flip the irrefutable proof and the base ability, because they've already shown that they're willing to change the checkboxes on customizable cards, and I think this is a simple enough change that it doesn't mess with a lot of investigators. And I am of the opinion that spending 3 XP to get the ability to get a working hunch instead of a cryptic research is nonsense, because there's very few people who want to do that. But I think that if you want to keep this card the way it is and not mess with the amount of evidence it can accrue, because for Daryl decks, again, that is important, right? It is important that Daryl has ways to produce evidence. You can just keep that ability, but make it so that you have to spend 3 evidence, which means 3 rounds of collecting evidence, which is a lot longer, to get a bonus clue. That seems kind of balanced to me. And then you can spend 3 XP in order to get this card draw ability, which is pretty powerful, and so I think that would be more interesting. Plus, it also balances out how you're going to spend your 10 checkboxes at that point. So yeah, that's my opinion on Empirical Hypothesis. I think it should go on the list, but I don't necessarily need it to be, you know, nuked into the ground. I think this would be a reasonable place to start. Alright, that's all for me. I hope you enjoyed this video. I tried to keep it pretty concise because I feel like there's a lot going on, but there's going to be a lot of opinions on this one, and I feel people are going to... Please post those in the comments. I didn't want to get off on like too many tangents, and I tried to keep it focused on the content of the video. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know what you think of these changes in the comments, because I'm super curious to hear, because I haven't played that much Arkham in the last like several months, right? I've been busy with Netrunner, I've been busy with Earthbound, I've just been busy with life in general, and so maybe I'm out of touch on a couple of these, right? Maybe I'm wrong. I want to be fully upfront about that. Like, I don't think that my knowledge of Arkham is perfect either. I think that probably the people at FRG have more knowledge about this than I do, but I do think that this this taboo list makes some choices, and maybe there needs to be some course correction. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave a like, leave a comment, and I'll be seeing you until the end of time.